After a Montreal demonstration this weekend calling for the defunding of police, a group of activists toppled a statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, Canada's first Prime Minister. Some who participated in Saturday's march were surprised to see the statue fall, but aren't upset with what happened.
It's glorifying a figure that has a legacy of genocide, and I think that it's wrong to not teach that legacy, and I think there could have been many opportunities for government to acknowledge the damage and the pain and the trauma.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he was deeply disappointed by the vandalism.
We have a lot of work to do, but choices like this, to rely on vandalism to advance causes, is not going to help anyone move forward the right way.
Quebec's premier called it unacceptable.
Of course, we need to fight against racism, but that's not the way to do it. We have to respect the history. We may have discussions in the next years about changes, but right now the decision is that it will be re-put in place.
We're going to hear from First Nations Child and Family Caring Society's Cindy Blackstock about this in just a minute. But first, we wanted to get more federal government reaction. Mark Miller is Minister of Indigenous Services, and he joins me from Ottawa. Minister Miller, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Catherine.
I wonder, given the issues at play, do you sympathize with the people who took down this statue?
Well, look, no one should break things to make a point in a democratic society. So this is a work of public art. It is in my riding. John A. Macdonald is a father of Confederation who dedicated 50 years of his life to building Canada. But, like art history, it is not uncontroversial. It's painfully so in my portfolio. As everyone knows, that John A. Macdonald is one of the architects of residential schools, starvation of Indigenous peoples on the plains, and his public statements that are quite painful in Quebec and for the Métis people with respect to Louis Riel and his hanging, though every dog in Quebec should bark. And so I don't believe anyone should break things to make a point. And indeed, this was a demonstration about systemic racism, which is a huge problem facing our country. And in fact, I believe it undermined that discussion. I spent most of Saturday myself thinking about why we couldn't issue an Amber Alert for a 14-year-old missing Indigenous person, woman, and those are issues that are present and top of my mind. And while the destruction of public art is concerning, there are many things in this country that we need to tackle with. And if we sort of destroy our past, then I think we do have to draw a distinction between history and its expression of history and art. I believe we're quite blind to the path forward that we want to pave as Canadians.
What's the answer to that? You draw that contrast, the Amber Alert versus the discussion over this. Why do you think one is getting so much more attention?
Well, I believe there's an expediency in seeing these acts draw attention in the public space. I believe that people will selectively choose elements of Canadian history that suit them for their particular current public purpose. I believe as a nation we are mature enough to look at these people that build our nation, sometimes on the backs, in the case of my portfolio of Indigenous peoples. But we have to look at it maturely in order to build and trace a path forward. I think sometimes we use these as rallying cries for other things going on. Unfortunately, we know that in a democracy like ours, that we like to think is the best in the world, and indeed I propose is, we do have some painful discussions that involve a serious reckoning with history, and at times a very painful one, particularly with respect to Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples living in Canada.
I wonder, you say, democratic institutions, the importance of a mature discussion. And I have heard some people say in response to that, there was a petition, about 46,000 people who said something needs to be done about this statue and others. Nothing happened. How do you respond to them?
Well, look, as a member of Parliament for downtown Montreal with a number of controversial statues and plaques, including one to Jefferson Davis, the first Confederate president that was removed only 2 years ago, statues that have Jacques Cartier towering over what appear to be heads of Indigenous people. We have a lot of thinking to do about the public art that is around Canada. I have very little time in my portfolio to consider these elements What I do know, and to your earlier point, there are a lot of challenges with respect to systemic racism, systemic discrimination that we need to tackle head on. Destroying things to make a point is not, in my mind, the trappings of a mature conversation that we need to have. I think that a lot of the protests, which is an important expression of a democratic right, are very important, and we need to listen to the people that are speaking. But I believe that dialogue ends when violence starts and destruction starts, and I think it undermines exactly what we should be speaking about, which is moving this country forward in a positive way. But that involves looking at some of the painful elements of the past that a lot of people are very eager to brush under the carpet.
I very much want to talk about next steps and the broader issues at play, but you point out the statues in your writing. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you think should happen to it, because the Mayor of Montreal has said they're going to talk to heritage experts about it, but Quebec's Premier seemed to make it pretty clear today that it's going to be restored and put back in place. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, the Heritage Commission in Montreal will take the stance that it takes with respect to that particular statue. I don't think it should have been destroyed in the first place. I look at my city and I look at how proud I am of it. But there are a lot of things missing, and I think immediately of the attention we need to draw to people like Oscar Peterson, Jackie Robinson, Louis Riel, who I mentioned earlier, and using that public art space is very important for us as a nation. And I think that a lot of time, if we're talking about the use of public assets and public art space, should be spent on that. And I've seen the immense strides that Montreal has made with respect to reconciliation and putting to the forefront those things. But there's a lot of reflection that needs to be made with respect to the statues that are still there. I believe that we should be able to look critically at the people that art expresses, including John A. Macdonald, including Laurier, who was across the street at Place du Canada, and including Canada's Forgotten War and the Boer War that is just behind that particular statue. All those merit reflection and not simply a knee-jerk reaction to tear it down when you're frustrated.
The Prime Minister was asked about this today. He said he understands the importance of the impatience, of Canadians who are facing discrimination when it comes to the broader issues at play. It was in June that he took a knee, and there are people asking today, where is the action that goes along with that, the concrete action in terms of fighting the discrimination that people are dealing with right now?
Well, what the Prime Minister put forward to Cabinet is a very important discussion on reviewing how our system has, and it's not.
But a discussion, Minister. It's still a discussion.
Well, he's asked Cabinet Ministers for bold thinking in and around how we tackle systemic racism. One of those is putting forward First Nations policing as an essential service, which Minister Blair has committed to, which is very important. There are many communities that are well underserved by police service in Canada. And in the right way, those that reflect proper recruiting of Indigenous peoples, proper training in the use of force, more access, more resources, more training of Indigenous peoples in those forces, a reform of how that police interacts in what everyone was obvious with respect to health checks, and a use of force that was very, very controversial and led to a death. This is something that we need to keep working on. There are things that we can do in the medium term, and that we need to do in the long term, as well as the immediate. And those are ones that you will see most notably, I believe, in the speech from the throne coming up, and the actions that this government proposes to take, and will take the Canadians for their views on it.
But I hear you saying, we'll see. I hear you saying proposal. I think back to June 5th, and I think back to your own words. That was after the death of Chantel Moore during a wellness check, and you, clearly very emotional about this, you said, I'm pissed, I'm outraged, there needs to be an accounting of what has gone on. Can you argue that we've made any significant progress at all on these issues in that time? Are you still pissed all these months later?
Look, anytime that we see, and we keep seeing it, anytime that we see this use of force exerted in a way that is untoward, that is wrong, unlawful, we need our police forces first and foremost to be able to make the changes internally, and the government will be there to make sure that it does happen. I've seen officers, I have seen leadership step forward, and perhaps they haven't spoken as they should initially, but they're taking account for it, and they are willing to move.
That is the RCMP commissioner that you're speaking
forward. But these are, again, these are always things that don't necessarily happen overnight. You can subscribe to the dialogue and the notion of bad apples, but this is systemic, and systemic reform does take time. It requires thought. It requires engagement with the people, notably the people that have been discriminated in Canada, that is Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples most notably, and reforms that are not necessarily limited to the police who wield these exceptional powers and have these exceptional responsibilities, but the system that puts it in place and that perpetuates it. I am a minister, and I'm not blind to the fact that I'm the Minister of Indigenous Services who was there to administer parts of the Indian Act, which is racist in its origin and continues to be discriminatory. And as we engage with communities as to the best way to get out of them, and indeed good progress has been made, there are times where we will make missteps, but there are times where we will take great strides forward, and I'm very confident in that respect. But again, it takes those long dialogues. It involves engagement with communities, with leadership, and having those painful conversations. And I think that's something our government has been dedicated to, and the Prime Minister continues to be dedicated to.
I want to ask you one last question about the broader issue of equality. The federal government announcing last week $2 billion to help the school restart in the provinces across Canada. When it came, though, to First Nation schools, $112 million. Given all the extra challenges that First Nations or communities are facing right now during COVID-19, why not more money? Someone with the AFN called for $1 billion, he said, that was necessary.
Well, it'll be no surprise to First Nations that they went into this pandemic without the same cards that the rest of Canada did. And we've been scrambling to address a number of the issues that we have to support schools, and indeed extra supports that community members and students in particular, the future of First Nations, Indigenous peoples, are facing. And this is something that has been told to us time and time again. $112 million is only part of the picture that has been painted. It represents actually more per First Nations child on reserve than it does with respect to the proportional amount of the $2 billion that was transferred. But within that $2 billion, you have transfers to territories and to provinces that also administer services to Indigenous people off reserve, and that is something that makes for a bit of a jurisdictional tangle, but it is something that we are prepared to work with as we move along and as we chart this on really uncharted course of COVID and adjust. I have mobilized capacity and resources within my department over and above the $112 million, but that sum is significant. It is a sum that will be put towards keeping First Nations children on reserve safe, but is very much only part of the picture of Indigenous schooling in Canada.
Okay, we're going to have to leave the conversation there, but thank you for your time today, Minister.
Thank you, Catherine.
That's Minister of Indigenous Services Mark Miller. Now, for more on this, we reach Cindy Blackstock. She's the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, which is currently in court with the federal government over the treatment of Indigenous children in the welfare system. She's in Ottawa. Cindy Blackstock, thank you for making the time. I wonder, what do you think of what you just heard from Minister Miller?
I felt like there is kind of this duplicity happening with the government response. At once they're saying, well, people shouldn't be taking down statues, and then they're pleading for patience, for decolonization. I think that they're not really embracing their responsibility, not only as a government that itself is systemically racially discriminatory towards First Nations, Métis, or Inuit peoples, but also as a government that hasn't acted on Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, now 5 years old, to remedy the whole situation around monuments and about ensuring that there's proper education for the public writ large with regard to Canada's history with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
On that conversation about monuments, I wonder what you thought when you heard about what happened to the Sir Johnny Mcdonald statue in Montreal.
I wasn't surprised. I think one of the things about statues is they really represent who you exalt in culture. I walk past Parliament and I see all these different statues there of people that we're supposed to remember. But all too often, this exaltation happens in the absence of a history. And when that's challenged, when people, for example, remove a statue of someone like John A. Macdonald, who was not only rigged the trial for Louis Riel and resulted in him being hanged, starved First Nations people off their reserves, created residential schools, and he also, by the way, paid bribes to the railway company to get his railroad bribe. So this is not a man of a clean record, shall we say. When you have someone like that without context and governments are slow to act, then people will take action on their own.
And part of the reason we asked you to be on the show is because you have a bit of experience when it comes to putting context, I guess, around some of these historical figures, both here in Ottawa and in Victoria as well, some of the conversations there around the Sir John A. Mcdonald statue. So I wonder if indeed this statue is going to go back up, as Quebec's Premier has suggested, what do you think, what kind of context, what would that look like for this particular statue?
Well, one thing that we need to do is create conversation around these statues. So there's
a lot of conversation going on right now.
I know, but conversation, but not just talk, but actually historically situate that person in their history, and understanding that not all legacies are equal. The railway would have been built by somebody else if not John A., right? I mean, that was just going to happen. It was an inevitability, and probably done with a lot less cruelty than John A.
I mean, you say that Alberta's Premier, Jason Kenney, in a series of tweets about this said, no Sir John A., no Canada.
I think that's a bit of an overstatement, to be honest. And even if, he did bring people around the colonies, but this is a guy with a mixed record. And I find so often that we're really a country that doesn't remember all of its history. We try to whitewash the history. So one of the things that we've done is we've actually worked with Beechwood Cemetery to create historical plaques of some of the actors in residential schools. And you don't just do the historical plaques for persons who have done things wrong. You actually do it for people of that period who did things right. You know, the minister talked earlier about the statement that John A. Macdonald said, which was that he shall hang and every dog in Quebec shall bark. The reason for that is that people of that period, Quebecers of that period, were protesting against the hanging of Louis Riel. So you take all that information, you put that on public display in a very prominent place, not as a small thing on the bottom, but very prominently. And then you incorporate that into educational criteria. The other thing we need to do is we need to have some courageous conversations and confront the racism in the government itself. The government itself has been found racially discriminating against 165,000 kids in 2016 in order to stop First Nations kids. 10 non-compliance orders have followed. They're still not in full compliance. We heard the minister talk about the murdered missing Indigenous women inquiry. Well, the government itself has pushed their response off into the distant future. We don't even know when that's going to happen. They tend to put more energy, political energy, into defending a statue instead of taking the actions needed to remedy the racial discrimination that is within the direct control of the Government of Canada to fix.
Well, I mean, Minister Miller seemed to be making the argument today that he would rather be having meaningful conversations about fighting systemic racism. And he said those conversations, I mean, you heard him, he said those conversations take time. He seemed to push forward to the throne speech. I wonder it's such a broad issue, and I guess it's a bit of a challenge to say, what do you want to hear? Because I'm sure there are many things, but give me an example of a concrete thing that you might hope to hear in the throne speech as evidence that the government is taking the kind of action you want to see.
Well, two things. One is there's recommendations on the books to solve a lot of these problems. So there doesn't need to be conversations, there needs to be action. And one of those recommendations is something called the Spirit Bear Plan, is to cost out all of the inequalities affecting First Nations children and families on reserve: water, housing, sanitation systems, education, child welfare. Let's get the big ticket of how much that's shortchanged on reserves and create a holistic plan like the Marshall Plan to remedy it. Canada refuses to adopt the Spirit Bear Plan, and it doesn't have another alternative. It wants to continue the colonial approach of addressing inequalities one drop by one drop and program by program. It hasn't worked until now. It's perpetuated systemic racism. I'd like to see the Government of Canada act on the Spirit Bear Plan.
Okay. Cindy Blackstock, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.